Hello and welcome back to EGX Digital. I'm James Batchelor, I'm UK editor of GamesIndustry.biz, and I'm here to talk about non-violent games. Well, I'm not. I'm here to talk with developers about non-violent games. I have with me a range of developers from across the UK of varying sizes, although I believe you're all kind of indie studios technically. We're going to be talking about the challenges of making games that do not rely on combat, that do not rely on keeping players engaged by making them better at killing all of the things. There are different experiences out there that can be had. There are different forms of gameplay. There are different emotions you can kind of create. And this is it's an area that I'm quite interested in. I'm going to try my absolute damnedest not to plug this too much during the panel, but I run a side project. I run a blog called Non-Violent Game of the Day, where in theory every day, it is not every day because I'm terribly undisciplined, but it's just a quick recommendation for a game that does not involve violence, for people to show people that there is more to video games than just killing. Because if you look at the most popular games, the most successful games, it tends to be games that just basically revolve around death. That is enough from me. Let's start going around our panel. We have got Danny Gray from Ustwo. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm Chief Creative Officer at Ustwo Games. So I've been there for about coming up to 8 years. So Monument Valley 1 and 2, Land's End we did for VR, Assemble with Care for Apple Arcade launch. Yeah, and basically every game we make is a non-violent game. So this is a really good, the one time I'm knowledgeable about the topic for a panel that I'm on.
It's almost like you were chosen on purpose. We have George Rowe from Aardman. Tell us a little bit about yourself and about the game you guys released a couple of years ago.
Hi, yeah, so I'm George. I've been at Aardman for about 6 years. We've been making games of kind of like smaller online and mobile stuff for about 12 years now, but we released our first console title, 1111 Memories Retold, which was a game about World War One where you play two non-combatant soldiers and sort of see the eyes through the war through their eyes. One that's very much about, how people experience war rather than just necessarily about the killing of it. And, Aardman, of course, we are mainly known for kind of family brands as well. Yeah, a lot of our content is generally centered around non-violent things.
Nice. Dan de Rocha, tell us a little bit about your games.
Yeah, so we've been making games for about 10 years now. Cube series, which are first-person puzzle games, and then Hue, which is a 2D puzzle platformer where you kind of shift the color of the world to make objects appear and disappear. And yes, similar games dealing with a lot of color, but both non-violent. We had a lot of fun making them, and now moving on to some new stuff. So yeah, excited about that.
Nice. Jennifer, I apologize, I didn't want to attempt your surname. Jennifer, introduce yourself and your studio, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jennifer. I've been making games for 15 years as a programmer, designer, and creative director. For 5 years, I worked in AAA, primarily on ninja and samurai action adventure games. About 10 years ago, I founded an independent studio called Nyamyam, and up until now, we've only released non-violent games. The first game is Tengami, which is an atmospheric adventure game in a Japanese pop-up book. And the second game that was released last year is called Ustwo Games and that's sort of like a Monty Python-esque comedy in which you play a doctor of astrology.
Lovely, thank you. And Chris, finally, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Chris Payne. I've worked for 20 years in the industry. Most of that was at TT Games, working on the Lego series. And about 4 years ago, I started my own studio, and I'm currently working on an unannounced non-violent game, which I can summarize as being an open world tend and befriend title.
Nice. Lovely. Right, let's dive straight into the conversation. I'm going to start off with, how do you personally define violence in games? So I asked that because on my blog, again, I'm not going to plug this too much, but on my blog, Non-Violent Game of the Day, I define violence as games where players are required or compelled to harm another living thing. So Mario stomping on a Goomba's head still technically counts as violence. Angry Birds exploding pigs counts as violence. All those games that are hunting where you're just like, you're taking out rabbits to carve its skin up to make a bigger gun holster, or that still counts as violence. How do you guys define violence?
Do you not include like environmental things in that definition? Like if you were to just rock up to a town somewhere and destroy a load of stuff, you might not kill living things. Still pretty violent though.
Yeah, okay. This is not non-destructive game. This is non-violent game. Like destruction games are fine.
It's an interesting one. I think you could talk about the precise definition for a while. For me, the important thing is that it's nothing to do with the mechanics of the game. Whether it's violent or not is entirely about the framing of the narrative and why you're doing whatever you're doing. So, for example, you can have a first-person shooter that is non-violent, like Splatoon, and the fact that they went with paintball rather than bullets allowed them to create entirely new mechanics with all of the territory control and so on, and so that really benefited the gameplay.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one. It's interesting you talk about Mario and the Goomba's head, because that was what I was considering. Like, does that feel like it's a violent thing when I consider it? Because obviously violence in the real world is bad because it hurts stuff and it hurts people who do not like being hurt. But whether in a computer game, no one's technically being hurt. So is it then about causing perceived hurt to something and how you feel about that hurt's being caused? And I really, when I was thinking about this question, I was like, it seems like could be such a subjective answer to what should be a simple question, if you see what I mean, because it's all about how you perceive whether you're hurting something or not and what that thing is. So I couldn't really go, it's this or it's that when I was thinking about it.
It's a very loaded question. I actually don't have a good answer to it for that reason, because to me, there are no violent games. I mean, games can have maybe violence as a theme. I guess most of the games that fall into that category of what maybe people would call a violent game have sort of like an obsession with war. But I don't really think of games in terms of like, is a game violent or non-violent at all.
I think, it is difficult to that end, but I think that generally when you think about it in your head, it's the more realistic and gruesome and brutal they are, like Call of Duties and things like that. But then on that spectrum, you have that all the way to something like Fortnite and even maybe in Fall Guys, to the extent that you're pulling and grabbing each other. But in my head, I wouldn't call that violence. It's kind of playful, but to your definition, maybe it's leaning in that way. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things there.
See, Fall Guys is an interesting one. So I covered that on the blog recently, and I immediately had people say, "Oh yeah, but you can pull people and throw them off a cliff into like the gloop below." It's like, yeah, but pushing and shoving, like it's not. It's like you say, it's very subjective. It's very difficult, and you will always have someone that says, "Ah, yes, but," And okay, well, let's expand on that then. Like the concept of gameplay that does not evolve around any kind of physical contact with other players. So, okay, like fine, you're not able to stab or shoot someone in Fall Guys, but you are able to push and shove. Let's say, for argument's sake, that still counts as violence. Like, what interactions then do you include between players so they can actually, or players or characters, so they can actually kind of interact with each other without it being counted as violence?
I like that. I like this because it's the kind of thing which is like every day in our lives, we walk around without punching people. Like there's so many human interactions that we have that don't involve stabbing people or throwing them off a cliff in front of 100 other people. Like, we can hug, we can wave, we can interact with objects, we can interact with, some kind of intermediary between us and another player. There's so many things that we can do that are non-violent in life, that the kind of reference material is in front of us like 24 hours a day, I would probably guess that nobody here is that violent in their real life.
Depends on my mood. No, you're right. You're right. I certainly haven't gone into town like started punching people randomly. So no, you're right. Okay. Well, building on that then, like, unless anyone kind of wants to add something to that point.
Well, that's just really quite made me think a little bit about, because obviously in most games when we're talking about violence, you're talking about physical violence, but most violence that people will face is more kind of mental and being insulted and stuff like that. And so would you consider a game, like in theory, the way you just abuse someone, like verbally, would you consider that a violent game?
I think that would depend on the framing. I think, I mean, for example, with Fall Guys, yeah, you are kind of like pushing and shoving each other. You can throw people off a cliff, but it's all framed as very sort of light and playful and cheerful. There's no indication that you're throwing someone to their death. You've just knocked them out of the game. It's a subtle distinction, but I think that's key. I think it's interesting that with Journey, for example, which is non-violent by any stretch, in early prototypes of that game, they had the ability for players to push each other, and that allowed them to troll each other by pushing each other off cliffs, and that was something that they explicitly did not want to be part of the experience. So they removed that ability for players even to be able to push each other, even though it still wouldn't be framed as a violent action, but it was something that would create a sense of frustration for the player on the receiving end.
So if you looked at it, because if you look at something that are relatively a bit similar, like Gang Beasts versus Fall Guys, you'd say Gang Beasts was violent, but Fall Guys isn't, because the intention is to damage and to harm.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, because Gang Beasts, the objective is you must, however comically it's portrayed, you must harm the other player to be the one who wins. Whereas Fall Guys, the vast majority of bumps and pushes and shoves I've seen have actually been quite accidental. So it's interesting with Fall Guys. So I swear recently, like, in the last week or so, they've actually come out and said, like in an interview, it's like, oh, nobody actually dies when they fall into that cliff. No one dies. It's something, I can't remember the words they use. It's something like they achieve spiritual ascension and then reincarnate or something. There's some sort of narrative thing that gets them out of like, no beans die in this.
Brilliant.
I don't want to derail the conversation too much, but I actually don't agree with the statement that we don't live in a violent world. Like, I mean, I see violence around us all the time. I mean, like, why have people been protesting on the streets, the Black Lives Matter movement, like for the last 6 months? It's because, in the system that we live, it encourages and allows violence towards specific groups. And so that's why I can fundamentally not agree with that. I mean, like, there's violence like all around us, and even like I live in London, the problem, like, with homelessness, like, to me that's also like a form of violence against marginalized people. So I also feel like I agree with what everyone is saying, that it's very contextual in video games whether you perceive something as violent or not. But like, to say that there are like so many interactions in our world that are not tainted by violence, without getting too political, I just feel I cannot agree with that.
I think that's fair. My kind of statement around that is less that there isn't violence in the world. It's more that as humans, we have multiple ways to interact with each other. Some people, a lot of people, choose to interact with each other in a violent way. That is true. But we have many, many ways to do that, and we should probably use more of those ways than the violent ones,
I think it's interesting that you could take, for example, something like This War of Mine, which it's not about committing violence, but the setting is extremely dark and violent. So I would certainly class that as a game for grown-ups, even if you're not actively participating in violence.
Well, let's build on Danny's point of, like, the different ways to interact. Like, are there limits, or are there seemingly limits on the ways that we can get players to interact with each other or with other characters in the world? So I'm going to ramble here a little bit, but like, so Fall Guys, you have like 3 or 4 abilities: jump, dive, and shove. That is like, or grab. That is the only abilities you have. But then you contrast that with something like, say, Red Dead Redemption 2, where yes, you can, hold a gun at someone and fire and shoot and punch and all this, but they also kind of went to this whole extent where, like, I think if I remember rightly, you hold down one of the triggers and it changes the different ways you can interact with someone verbally. So it's like you can greet someone or diffuse a situation or antagonize or whatever, and they try to expand. But it certainly, when I played, it felt a little cumbersome. It felt like they were trying to, I'm a console gamer, I'm limited to the remit of a control pad. But like, it felt like the number of interactions they were trying to put into that game, combining both violent and non-violent, kind of exceeded the number of buttons you have available. So like, are games kind of limited to the type of interactions you can have in the scope of your game? I think that's basically what I'm trying to get at.
No, they're not, because controls can be, contextual and situational. It's definitely not limited by design. It might be limited by, production feasibility and budget, but it's definitely not a design limitation.
I would say that there are certain limitations, in the sense that one of the reasons that we have so many games that are about moving around spaces, shooting, fighting, is because that sort of thing is very easy for a computer to model. As soon as you get into a more narrative space, we don't even understand how our own brains work fully. So attempting to model a cast of characters that are interacting in a realistic way is a very complicated thing, and it's largely done by just pre-scripting everything. But I think there's a lot of room for exploration in narrative fields, coming up with mechanics that are reasonably simple but are thematically loaded, so that they are like the whole sort of indie platformer cliche, where there's a trend for indie platformers to become very metaphorical. So stuff like John Blow's platformer and things like and Celeste and so on, where it's all about using those mechanics to represent something a little bit deeper than just jumping on blocks.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I think the kind of 3D combat games. 3D combat is such a kind of open-ended way to do kind of real-time resource management, that there's so much gameplay in there, but also you're using your reflexes and whatever lets you get those kind of flow states. So that's why so many people end up in that, because it is so obvious that is a really good way to achieve all those things. And because it's kind of, we're in some ways evolutionary hardwired to enjoy those, using your reflexes and pattern matching and stuff like that. That's just the sort of way that fits best. But I don't think it has to be the only way that fits best. I think you can find other mechanics that touch all those same buttons and same areas. It's just not the first one you think of, which is normally combat. You have to work harder to try and figure out what those things are.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of exploration to do there still within the game space, bringing new things to the table that haven't been touched upon. You could say, to Chris's point about Splatoon, almost like reskinning traditional mechanics that aren't violent. And I think there is a lot to explore there, and it's quite exciting to think about. But there's also like a business case to that. It's got to sell at the end of the day. It's got to be familiar. And I think that's where you kind of are at odds with those two things, with creativity and business. So, yeah.
I think as well, on that idea that it's easier for us to model violent behavior is true, but I also think that's because we've indexed in that too much over time. It's been like, and also I think it's because it's the most kind of obvious, impactful form of player agency that's easy for players to understand, like instantly. Being able to move someone with a conversation, as you said, is much harder to do than it is to go and punch them in the face. But I think it's just a case of it is massively, massively possible. It's just more difficult and nuanced to do that than it would be to kind of take the easy option, which we all understand and we all know and everybody gets. So
do you think there's oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say my data might be a little old, but I do remember that for the longest time, for example, non-violent games have been the most popular games. If you look at stuff like The Sims, and I think Wii Sports at the time was definitely for years and years like the most sold and highest grossing game. So I don't even think it's true that violent games are the most popular ones. I just feel like that they are getting sort of like, actually I saw data around that. I think 80% of the video games that the games industry markets, even if you go like in the supermarkets like Tesco or Sainsbury's, will be first-person shooters. And only 20% of those that get marketed are non-violent games, like, for example, The Sims or Wii Sports. But it doesn't actually mean that the best-selling games are these violent games. I mean, like, that's like, I think, like a common sort of like misconception that is because of the mismatch in the marketing budgets.
I definitely think that there's an issue there, because I've pitched a non-violent game to a publisher who responded that they already had a non-violent game on their slate, as if like there's only room in the market for one. Like, if you flip that, and like nobody would say sort of like, oh well, we've already got one combat game, that's enough. There's definitely a bias towards combat games in the marketing side of things, I think.
Do you not think it's a mixture though? Like for me, like I feel like that kind of ignores how deep-seated and insidious the whole thing is. Like a desire for violence, or a desire to play a game that sees an army move to another country and save the day. Like I do think there's an argument to be made that, you know, all kinds of games should have all marketing budgets and everything would be great. But I do genuinely think that there is a desire to play those kinds of experiences. And that's something that should be talked about and investigated and, you know, actually discussed. I think that's a dangerous thing, you know, that's kind of normalized.
It's interesting that sports kind of exist as almost an outlet for people to express their kind of very kind of like those deep-seated primal urges to sort of like to be the best and prove that you're better than other people, and that sort of tribalism and the way that people form up around their favorite teams and so on is it's kind of like a safer outlet for those basic instincts that human beings kind of have just from evolution. But also, arguably, violent games are a bit of an outlet of the same sort, where you can get that visceral adrenaline shot of being able to shoot at people and so on, but you're not actually hurting anybody, and it's socially acceptable.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask, actually. Like, do you think there's such a prevalence of violent games because they are the best way to explore those things, better than film, better than, you know, novels and things like that? Is that why we found this way that people can experience those things in a safe way, the way that films more normally allow you to explore emotions you wouldn't normally feel and stuff like that? Have people just grabbed upon that and go, aha, here it is, and that's why they're so out there?
That's a really good question. I don't have an immediate answer for that. I think it's difficult to say that like games are really a good way to explore that, because I can't think of any really great examples of games doing that. And even when a game gives you the choice to be violent or not violent, it's very difficult to sell that choice in a context where most people have certain expectations of games. So there is an expectation that you can beat the bad guy and you can get all the loot and so on, and you can see all the content. So in the same way that people will play a game, and even if they get the good ending, they might go back and make different choices just so that they can see the bad ending, because they know that there's different strands of story that they feel like they're missing out on otherwise.
There also isn't much grey area in that. So I'm going to Dishonored. I love the Dishonored games, and I like playing them non-violently. I like sneaking through, and I always do like there's the non-violent way of taking out each target, which I think is fantastic. And you can knock people out, which, okay, that probably counts as violence, but you know they're going to wake up later with a sore head. They're not dead. And I try to play that way. Very occasionally, things will go wrong. I'll get spotted and I'll panic and I'll hit the slash button, the fight button, and all of a sudden he's like decapitating people or like maiming arms. Yeah. There's blood spilling everywhere. And it's like, where did that come from? Like, I think the other one was like Assassin's Creed Origins. Like, I'll try and sneak through and you're stabbing people in the back, but like, I'm trying to knock people out or trying to sneak through and not kill anyone at all. I'm trying to get through, almost ghost it. You get in one scuffle with the guards and you're suddenly drenched in blood. And it's like, there's no grey area there. It's like, my Bayek, my Corvo wouldn't be that violent, and there's no way of expressing that.
I feel like I'm the worst person to be on this panel, because all of these things that you're describing are like super fun to me in video games. So I don't know, actually, I don't think that it's the violence that drives people to these games. I think there's definitely sort of like a fetishization of war nostalgia that we have. And I know that a lot of people, for example, my brother falls into that category, like that battlefield that allows you to play 100 versus 100 people. That's like really his thing, because he's just like, oh yeah, we are, we are replaying World War II, World War One, and he just really gets off on that. But I don't think it's necessarily about the killing. It's sort of like this weird war nostalgia that some people have. And then I think we see a lot of sort of like, there's also like a lot of gun fetish, which I'm actually personally really critical of, because I don't like how some of the largest game developers in the world are cozying up to gun manufacturers, seeing like how much trouble we have with mass shootings, primarily in North America. But then I think there's also like a third aspect of it, and which is just these games are really good. These games are really well designed, they're really well made. Like you were giving the example of Dishonored, and you're kind of like sneaking up on this person, and that gives you like this real kind of like sense of anticipation and nervousness, like, am I going to be able to do it? Am I going to be able to do it? So it's like really excited, and it's building this anticipation the longer it gets. And then, the decapitation or whatever happens then is sort of kind of like is a payoff, but it's not really about the fact, that that's the outcome. It's just that you succeeded in what you wanted, which is to overcome this person. It's not that I'm looking forward to cutting off this person's head, right? It's just like, it's like similar to Candy Crush. Like when you're doing like your chain, and you get like the nice visual effect and the sounds, people beeping explosion, and that's sort of kind of like your dopamine rush that you get.
You say that, so, but isn't there like a Fallout perk where it's like, if you turn this on, then all heads will come off and all arms will come off? Isn't there? I think there's a thing in the Fallout games. It's like, here, have more limbs.
I think some people do really like the whole visceral gore aspect of things. I mean, there's games like Sniper Elite, which where you've got the X-ray mode, so you can see all the like damage to internal organs being done, and like I'm completely turned off by that. I mean, it's technically astounding, but I'm really uncomfortable that is a selling point that people like.
I think the question is, though, isn't it? You're right, but behind the scenes, like Jennifer's right, behind the scenes, mechanically, design-wise, it's all the same stuff. It's all the same stuff in any of these games. But I think the question is, why are the majority of the context used violent ones as opposed to non-violent ones? Like there are more settings, there are more contexts. Blowing someone's head off is the equivalent of crushing a 5x5 block in a puzzle game. But why do we not see a bigger variety of contexts and settings when it comes to big budget games? I guess is the interesting question. And then it's the kind of chicken and egg question of, is that because that's what we put marketing behind, or is that because that's what people want and that's what people buy? That's the kind of, is society informed by media, or is media informed by society,
Yeah, it's a difficult one.
There was an excellent article about something similar. I don't remember the second name of the journalist. It was a couple of years ago. It was by a journalist called Tracy, was her first name, I think. And she did a similar thing where she looked at why are there so few women gamers when, going back all the way to the 70s, when sort of like the arcades came up, you actually had a lot of parity, like 50-50. And she was actually able to make a case that, yes, it is marketing. This is how marketing, this is really the power of marketing. And this is a lot of the problems that we have, primarily with gender. For example, a lot of people talk about the pink and the blue aisle in supermarkets, like for kids' toys. That's also because, one of the core marketing pillars is if you can sort of like really speak to a specific subset of an audience, if you really grab those people, then they will be your continuous customers. It's a really interesting article that I recommend people search out. It's really the power of marketing, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that we have created as an industry.
I want to kind of look then at mechanics, because as we've established kind of violent mechanics, or at least combative mechanics, are the most polished because we have the most, as an industry, we have the most experience developing them. Like Jen, as you were saying, like kind of there's that anticipation of taking out an enemy. What alternatives can we do? What alternatives can developers explore that are as engaging? Like, as I think it was you who said, Danny, like, decapitation should be as exciting as getting a 5-block combo in Candy Crush. Like, what other interactions, what other mechanics would make an engaging enough core loop that players could pour more, hours and hours into that rather than getting better at killing things?
Well, I mean, I'm as someone who, ashamed admits, I spend a lot of time playing FIFA. If you could make FIFA palatable to people who don't like sports, I'm sure you'd get everybody. Like if you could make it with wizards or something. But no, I mean, I really like games like Yoku's Island Express, where you take a totally different mechanic and stick it into another game, and you get something interesting out of the other end. And I think that's really where the kind of rich seam of stuff is to have, is just mixing two things that totally seemingly don't fit together. And that's how we can get out of so much of the violence standard 3D combat route, like getting a bit more inspiration from different things.
Yeah, we worked on an experimental first-person cookie clicker called Thorn, which came out a year or so ago, and that's the typical first-person gameplay and glossy graphics and things like that. But it's the cookie clicker mechanic baked into these different machines, and then once you've upgraded one machine, you've got enough credits, you can let that thing do it by itself and then move on to the next one. And yeah, that was had that sort of addictive sort of feel to it, but kept you engaged, and it had narrative to it as well. So I think, yeah, there's many ways you could replicate that, but in different ways. So yeah.
I don't think that we necessarily need new mechanics as such, because we've got quite a lot of mechanics, and a lot of them, once you take the context away, they're very abstract. I mean, first-person shooters is ultimately sort of like getting a crosshair over a moving target. There's multiple ways to frame that so that it isn't violent. Platforming is control of a moving object through a space using a variety of different mechanics. In most of these cases, you could just as well do a non-violent game, and even quite tame mechanics that are just sort of like just single button press to like deliver the result of a fetch quest or something, can be made extremely satisfying with the right amount of juice and little feedback mechanisms for the player, in the same way that a lot of the like gory finishing moves in video games end up being a single button press at the right moment, and it's just all of the little particle effects and sound effects and camera shake and all of those things go together that make that particular button press feel much more significant than other button presses.
And I genuinely think you can take any, and this is actually just what we do in prototyping as well when we're prototyping things internally. I genuinely think you can take any genre that exists and any type of game and give it a completely different context to make it approachable to different types of people. Like, say, for example, we're developing this idea that is, what's the Ustwo Games version of a turn-based strategy game? So an Ustwo Games version is kind of like making it approachable for non-games experienced people, right? Trying to create a different type of context, different types of objectives. And we've even, like, say, for example, in that genre, you take the Mario and Rabbids one. Even the Mario game is them shooting at each other with laser guns. Like, there's got to be more context and more kind of containers to put that kind of genre within. And there is, like, we've got something now that's non-violent, has objectives that are beyond winning. So, like, as he said, some of that stuff around, dominating the opposition, it's like you can take that and make it more about how do you ensure the people on your team have fun and enjoy themselves and trust each other. It doesn't even necessarily, because that's how when you play sport when you're a kid, right? When you play sport when you're a kid, it's fine to win, but it's more about having fun with your mates. I think that we're just not utilizing the kinds of objectives and the kinds of settings that we could do. We're actually super narrow. And I think that's because it feels like we're still quite immature as an industry in terms of the areas in which we decide to create games. At least in my opinion. I don't mean immature in kind of like you know, childish. I mean, just in terms of length of the industry.
I think it's potentially a function of one of the fundamentals of story is that it's about conflict between different characters. And in video games, again, if you want to model conflict, the easiest way to model that is a very physical combat based thing, because an emotional conflict is much more woolly and thing. I think it could be explored, and I'd like to. Yeah, it's just like combat is the most obvious kind of way to create a dramatic story in an interactive context.
I think everybody has made really excellent points, and I don't really have much to say except for, and I think Dan mentioned this earlier. You know, like we also need to put the money where our mouth is. It's just like at the moment, you know, the highest budgets go to first-person shooters, and they do deliver. You know, there is a market segment, they are a popular market segment, and they are a pillar of the games industry that's here to stay. To me, the question is more how are we raising more pillars that get equal amount of funding or possibly more to kind of like counterbalance that and create this you know, this maturity that Dan's talking about.
That's the thing. I on the blog, I try my damnedest to kind of strike a balance between indie and AAA games that I'm covering, because I want to show it's kind of the full breadth, but inevitably I end up covering more indie games than I do AAA ones. Non-violent AAA games tend to be sports or racing, which is, I guess, a sport. Like, that is it. You don't really get like a AAA puzzle game. You may very, very occasionally get something like a Portal, but it's so few and far between. Case in point, this panel, you guys are all indie developers. Like, so I'd love to see more investment from AAA into non-violent stuff beyond The Sims, like just other ideas, other gameplays. And we're slowly getting that. I guess you got things like the EA originals, things like Unravel, but again, that's an indie title, but with the backing of a AAA game rather than a AAA project. Like, I'd love to see more from the AAA space. Do you think we'll ever see that?
I think Animal Crossing does pretty well.
Yeah, I've heard that's fairly successful.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely right. Animal Crossing, like you said, Life is Strange was huge. Continues to be huge.
I like the way that you can say. Sorry, go on.
Like speaking from an indie perspective, you know, someone who makes non-violent games that I think would be interesting to people who play The Sims, Animal Crossing, Life is Strange, is really notoriously difficult to reach that audience if you're like a small studio, because they don't seem to be. I don't know if maybe I'm going about it wrong, but they seem to be really in the grip of EA and Square Enix and Nintendo. And it seems to be really difficult as an outsider to come and reach these people with your game. I mean, I've tried to figure this out for many, many years now. Like, how do I actually reach these people? And I haven't come to a good conclusion, because I don't think that they interact much with what we see from from a core gaming audience. I don't think that they visit the same publications, that they watch the same streamers, or maybe they don't even do YouTube or Twitch.
Yeah, well, I think there's a perception that if you're doing a family age game and you're not Nintendo, then it's going to be a bit of a crap game. You know, if you're sort of targeted towards kids, gamers aren't going to buy that. Whereas, you know, unless it's a Nintendo, you've got that 30 years, 40 years of heritage, you know it's going to be a good game. But if you were to see something that looked like that, not made by them, you might go, as a gamer, you go, well, I'm not going to buy that, because you're so used to the adult-led games being the good games. So perhaps that's where the perception needs to change.
We are running low-ish on time. We've got about 5-ish minutes left, so I've got 2 more questions. One is, where can everyone find out a bit more about your games? And then I've got a more fun one to finish off on. So, Danny, let's start with you.
You can go find more about us at ustwogames.co.uk. We're making a game called Alba, a wildlife adventure at the minute, which is like an open world game, but again, no combat. It's just about cool wildlife stuff and traveling around an island. So go and check that out. There's stuff on the YouTube and other bits. And I don't think we can talk about the release date yet, but go and have a look. It's cool.
Cool. George?
You can see what we're doing at Aardman.com. Obviously, 1111 Memories Retold came out a few years ago. We released a Shaun the Sheep game last year on Switch as well, which was a remaster of an older game. We've got a new thing in development at the moment, but it's all very secret and I can't say anything about it.
Jen, what are you guys working on?
A climate fiction game in the future. Might have some violent elements because you're angry, but not sure yet. You can find more about us on Nyamyam.games.
Cool. Dan?
Yeah, you can find out more about us at jawdropgames.com. We're currently working on a rhythm music-based shooter, so you can find out more about the game there.
Nice. And Chris?
My website is quantum-soup.com, and we haven't announced the game that I'm working on at the moment, but hopefully not too long. Keep an eye out for that.
I'm going to cheekily plug that blog I keep on mentioning. My non-violent game blog is nvgotd.tumblr.com, or you can find it on Twitter at nvgotd. That's non-violent game of the day. And my last question for the day, because clearly I can't cope much longer than this, is what is your favourite non-violent game?
Can I say 3?
Yeah, let's go for it. Let's get some recommendations out there. Yes.
Well, I mean, as I say, at FIFA, I play a lot of FIFA. I really liked Short Hike. I loved the Short Hike, actually.
Super, really, really cool.
It's just the story, how it feels to play, everything about it. And then for a non-violent game that gets you that feeling of flow and pattern recognition and whatever, I just think Super Hexagon is still like one of the most engaging little games to play for that kind of feeling.
Okay, I'll go. Sorry, Jen.
Okay. My friend Ellen released a game yesterday, a few days ago, called A Monsters Expedition as a puzzle game that you can get on Apple Arcades and Steam. And that's like, I've played it all throughout development. I've been playtesting it, and that's an absolutely fantastic puzzle game.
My favorite of all time probably is Monument Valley. Thank you, Danny.
Yeah, nice, mate. I'll send you the money in the post.
It's fantastic. Most recently would be Spiritfarer. That's absolutely gorgeous, and it's on Xbox Game Pass right now.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm playing that at the moment as well. It's annoyingly similar to another idea we had, and they did it better than first.
Go on then, Danny.
I was genuinely going to say that. Another thing, I just seen somebody from ours called Laura Demai, who's one of our programmers at Ustwo Games. She's working a thing in her spare time about growing plants, and it's super cool. So go and take a look at Laura Demai on Twitter. You'll find her through Ustwo Games stuff. She's doing really cool stuff.
Dan, let's have a good one to finish off. Go for it.
Probably going to be 2. One is a Mini Metro. Love playing that game on the tube and stuff, funny enough. And I think that just goes down to childhood, enjoying playing, train sets and that type of thing. And then the other one is Beat Saber. I guess it's not violent.
No, Beat Saber counts.
Good.
Yeah.
It's lightsabers, but yeah.
Beat Saber.
Love that game.
Yeah. Good fun, good exercise.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for your time this afternoon. That's been absolutely brilliant. And thank you, dear viewer, for watching. And thank you for joining us for EGX Digital. Plenty more content to come. You can find all the information at the PAX EGX website.